Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the YouTube series. And in this particular lesson, I'm going to talk to you about brainstorming. Now, I will say that I did not personally come up with this content. I want to give credit where credit is due. This came out of a blog by creately.com, which I thought was quite useful. And so I use that as the resource for this particular material. I also put the web link on the slide so that if you want to go out and go back to the web link, you can. And they have a lot of other great materials that I'm not going to be covering in this lesson. All right. So by introduction, it's important to know that coming up with fresh ideas is not always so easy, right? So in research, there are a lot of things happening and a lot of studies that are already been published on a topic. So it's important to, spend some time developing your ideas before you even start a study. So, and I have to tell you that even when you try and brainstorm, some of the typical ways that we try and brainstorm, pardon me, we hit snags, we hit roadblocks, we get stuck. So that pushes us to say, well, maybe I should brainstorm in a different way. So below, I'm presenting 7 brainstorming ideas by creately.com. And so these are not an all-inclusive list, but these are useful brainstorming strategies. So the first thing that we talk about are mind maps. A mind map is a tool used to visualize or organize information, and you can capture your ideas fairly easily using mind maps and make sense of the relationships between information that you come up with. They're also a nice way of organizing and breaking down and analyzing ideas as they come through. So how do you do it? So as you brainstorm around a topic, you should have the main topic here and then start adding branches around it. And then you could add more details to the map as you need more branches. And they could be images, symbols, links, or whatever it might be. But here's an example of what a mind map looks like. So let's say you were creating a meeting, right? So Lex Luthor was trying to have a secret meeting to plan to finally beat Superman. Well, there might be things in the meeting that you have to address, right? So Lex Luthor might say, well, what do I need? Well, I need to have an agenda for the meeting. I need to review the minutes of the last meeting. There are a series of action items I might need to do. And then notes, right? Taking notes for the next meeting. So the agenda, so let's say Lex Luthor wanted to strategize. So first we need to introduce crime bosses, right? So that'll keep Superman busy. The crime bosses would be introduced in the meeting, and then you would strategize the various plans. And then ultimately, each of these crime bosses would be delegated tasks as it relates to the plan. Now, then you might review the previous minutes and approve that. Then you might send specific actions. Well, we need to find kryptonite, build bunks, and take any notes that are necessary, right? So you get the idea. This is just a fun, goofy way of talking about it. But you start with a general idea and then you branch off from there. And you'll see that in the bolded, underlined teal, those are the major steps along the way. And then the lighter teal are just the branches that connect. So there are other ways to do it. So instead of having the diagrams that we talked about, you could also have a fishbone diagram, which is also known as reverse brainstorming. And in reverse brainstorming, instead of finding solutions to a problem, you wonder how to cause it or how to achieve the opposite result of what you expect. So you start by putting the problem at the head of the fish, and this will make more sense why it's called fishbone in a minute. And instead of asking, well, how do you solve it, ask your team how to cause it or how to make it worse. You want to list reverse solutions that the team comes up with. And it's very important that when you're brainstorming, you don't reject any ideas. All ideas go on the board, no matter how trivial they may seem. And now you flip the reverse solutions, right? And on each of the fishbones, you write down the real fixes for the problem you came up with by flipping the reverse solutions. And I'll show you what that looks like. So again, here you see at the head of the fish is the problem, right? And then you talk about at the top, the causes, and then causes that are linked to specific causes. And then on the bottom, it's the exact opposite of the causes that were on the top. So if you're trying to exacerbate the symptoms, then, or to cause it, then you want to say, well, if these are the things that exacerbate the symptoms or cause it, then we want to do the opposite. So that's why we have two sides. And if you look at the arrows, it kind of does look like bones at the center of the fish when you fillet it. And so that's why it's called fishbone strategies. You also can have flowcharts. Flowcharts, I absolutely love flowcharts. These are helpful for me. So in general, flowcharts help you get from point A to point B. And then the steps you need along the way. So how do you do it? So first you need to identify your goals, where you would like your business to be, or where you would like, how you would like to accomplish your research as it relates to our studies. So figure out where you're at and what you're capable of doing, build your team around what you're capable, and then you break it down into smaller parts, coming up with steps that you need to take to achieve the goal. And then you might assign pieces of those steps to various members of the team. Now, in many research studies, you're like, well, why are you talking about teams? Well, many research studies, you work in teams. There are multiple people working towards a common goal. And in, experimental psychology and research methods, many times professors put people into group projects. So that's going to be useful. So here, again, here's a flow chart, again, it cascades, right? So you ask a question, and you do the background research, you develop a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, and then it goes through a prism, through a filter, pardon me, and it goes yes, no, and then there are multiple decisions to make along the way. Now, this diagram should look pretty familiar for many of you, because if you watched a lecture that I had in another video on where to start with research, it starts like this, right? So, and you'll see that you have ideas at the top, and then eventually you develop research questions and collect data and analyze it, and then you test hypotheses, and then you continue to go through this refinement. Now, a SWOT analysis, I don't think this is as useful for research methods as much as it's used for organizational structure. So SWOT is an abbreviation that stands for strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. So if you were to do a SWOT analysis, you would create these 4 quadrants, and you would put strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and then you would answer the questions that are in each of the boxes. So for strengths, you might say, well, what are your strengths? What do you do better than others? What are your unique capability and resources that you possess? what do others perceive as your strengths? Then in weaknesses, it requires a little more insight. What are your weaknesses? What do your, competitors do better than you? What can you do to improve on your weaknesses and so forth? And then opportunities and play, and it's the same thing. The questions are there, so I'm not going to continue to read them, but that's how you do a SWOT analysis. Now, in literature, you might have heard the who, what, when, where, why, and how approach. Well, believe it or not, that is a brainstorming technique, right? So there are 6 key questions, and it's called starbursting. So in the middle of the 6-pointed star, you put down the idea or the problem or the product or the service that you're brainstorming about, and then you try and address each of those 6 questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. And then what you do is you brainstorm questions that are linked to each of those elements. So in the who point of the star, you develop who questions. Well, who is going to be responsible for data collection? Who is going to do the literature review? Who is going to do the presentation? What do we need in the literature review? What do we need for data collection? Right, and so forth. You get the idea. So you should have at least 3 questions in each point. You should discuss the answers for each of the questions briefly, and then at the end, you should have figured out the solutions to the issues, but have a clear vision of the next steps. So here's the starburst in a visual, right? The who, what, when, where, why, and how. I say this is good for literature, but it's also very good for research if you want to conceptualize delegating your research assignment to various people. We also have things called affinity diagrams. So affinity diagrams, the way this works is you brainstorm around a topic and it generates a whole bunch of information. But the information likely will fall into categories. So as you're brainstorming, you might put a general category and start linking ideas based on their similarities. And so you might have column, 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 column. You have a bunch of columns and you just link it based on it, right? So here is a visual of how you might do that. So group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, group 5. Now, each of the groups should have a name attached to it. So whatever their similarity, whatever makes them similar is what makes that group its name, right? So for example, if you were doing research and you had a bunch of articles and the articles were talking about gender-based discrimination in the workplace. While you were doing a workplace-based research study, the group 1 might be based on gender. But is gender the only form of discrimination? Probably not. So if you found other studies that were, ethnic-based discrimination, right? Then group 2 might be all the studies that link. And this affinity diagram is going to be quite useful when you're writing your introduction. So when you're trying to figure out how the journal articles link to one another, use the affinity diagram and put them into categories, because the ones that fit together are going to be written juxtaposed to one another. All right. And concept maps is probably what most of you are familiar with. You're probably, you might have heard them referred to as thought webs or whatnot. So you just have a bubble and then all the branches that come out of that bubble. And then if there are other bubbles, you create bubbles and it just branches like a spider web. So again, similar to other ideas, everything gets put on this concept map, no matter how trivial they may seem. And you also want to try and make connections between the concepts if you can. So here is a very busy version of that. And I'm not going into the image very much other than to highlight for you that you've probably seen this if you've ever been at a seminar with a whiteboard. They use a lot of these spiderweb mapping procedures. So that in a nutshell is the lecture. So I'm going to stop my share and just say, I don't know if all 7 of these brainstorming strategies are useful for you and your particular needs, but I hope that you can take 2 to 3 that you really find value in and it help you with your research. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll see you next time. Be well, everybody.